Hey guys, in this video we are going to be covering Chapter 14, Money, Banks, and the Federal Reserve System. So before we get started here, I do want to talk a little bit about how this is going to flow into the next couple chapters. When talking about money, the banks, and the Federal Reserve System, the reason it's important to understand these definitions is because this is the basis of monetary policy. And monetary policy is what the Federal Reserve does to impact aggregate demand and adjust the economy during periods of recessions and inflationary periods. So let's go ahead and define what money is. Money is an asset that people are generally willing to accept in exchange for goods and services or debt payment. An asset is anything of value owned by a person or a firm, and we have some modern forms of money, and we'll also be creating a model relating prices to the amount of money. So before we had money, if you wanted to trade with another person, another business, another country, you used the barter system, which meant trading goods and services directly for other goods and services. Trades require a double coincidence of wants, which means you have something someone else wants and they have something that you want. Eventually, society started using commodity money, which are these goods used as money that also have a value independent of their use of money. Existence of money made trading much easier, it allowed for specialization, and it was an important step in developing the global economy. So we have some examples of commodity money, which include... Get a better pen real quick. This includes animal skins, precious metals. So we can think back to initially when America was first being colonized by the Europeans. There was a trade on beaver pelts in the Ohio River Valley area, and that was a very expensive commodity over in Europe since they had already trapped a lot of their beavers on the European continent. So using America as a new hunting ground, essentially, they were able to generate more money by selling these animal skins or trading these animal skins. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk now about the four primary functions of money. Before we do that, I didn't put a note up here about the barter system, but I want to go ahead and mention it since I did explain it. Okay, so now let's talk about the four primary functions of money. So money is used as a medium of exchange, a unit of account, a store of value, and a standard of deferred payment. So we're going to go ahead and write these down. Medium of exchange, zoomed in, unit of account, store of value, and standard of deferred payment. Okay, so we're going to talk about each one of these in turn. A medium of exchange, that means it's acceptable to a wide variety of parties as a form of payment for goods and services. So you can use it to exchange for different goods and services as a unit of account. It allows to measure value in a standard manner. So keep in mind, when the US was developing, there was thought that maybe each individual state would have their own currency, but that would not facilitate interstate trade if you had to exchange currency every time you crossed a state border. By using the dollar as our standard currency in the US, we have a standard unit of account. Store of value, it allows people to defer consumption to a later date. Other assets are able to also store value, but money is the most liquid asset, so it can be easily exchanged for goods. It stores value, but can also be used to facilitate a trade for another good or service. And then a standard of deferred payment. This is similar to a store of value, but it facilitates exchanges across time. We're anticipating that the purchasing power or the value of the currency in the future is going to be predictable. Okay, so in talking about specifically a medium of exchange here, we want to talk about the different characteristics that a good should have. And so we're trying to identify, what can serve as money. This is especially important in discussions related to potentially going to a cashless society, the use of virtual currencies, Bitcoin, or potentially using Venmo, Cash App, those types of things. So, what can serve as money? One, the good has to be acceptable to most people. It should also be standardized quality, so 2 units are exactly alike. They need to be homogeneous. It needs to be durable. That means the value won't be lost if it wears out. It has to be valuable relative to its weight, so it can be easily transported even in large quantities, and it should be divisible enough to be used for purchases of both low-priced and high-priced goods. So we talked about commodity money already. It has a value independent of its use as money. Some historical and modern examples of this were cowrie shells in Asia. They were used for money and currency. Precious metals, gold and silver, were also used as commodity money. Animal skins and pelts, we talked about that a little bit in colonial North America. And then also another example of commodity money would be cigarettes in prison camps. So now that we've established commodity money, let's talk about fiat money. So fiat money is any money such as paper currency that's authorized by a central bank or government body. It doesn't have to be exchanged by the central bank for a commodity money. So paper money initially was issued in China in the 10th century, and it was exchangeable for a commodity, either gold or, in later cases, silver. So it was commodity backed. Now, in more modern societies, currency is not necessarily backed by gold or silver or commodity. The Federal Reserve is the central bank in the US, and this bank issues our currency, the dollar, which is a fiat money. The dollar, what do I want to say, issued by the Fed. So the reason fiat money is important is because we need to make sure that households and firms have the confidence that if they accept fiat money in exchange for dollars and services, they won't lose value. That currency won't lose value during the time that they hold them. So it's essential in an economy that uses fiat money, that, where do I want to put this? Households and firms must have confidence in this case, the dollar will not lose the value during the holding period. Okay. So if people stop believing in fiat money, if they stop believing that the value is going to be constant, then no one is going to use fiat money, and it will either dissolve back into using commodity money or the barter system. So let's talk a little bit about a cashless society. In the US, there's been some talk about potentially moving towards that, which has faced serious backlash and arguments from both sides. In 2017, the PowerPoint uses the example of Sweetgreen. It was a chain of salad restaurants that stopped taking cash to speed up service and eliminate robberies, which they came under fire because people questioned whether or not that was actually legal. But it is actually. Firms aren't actually obligated to accept currency as payment. Debts are a different story here. And then you think about the converse situation in which some convenience stores, gas station, other businesses may refuse to take large denomination bills, like bills over 50, bills over 100. So there's been more talk since countries overseas, specifically the Scandinavian countries, such as Sweden, they have almost switched to being cashless, and whether or not the US will follow suit is still up for debate. Okay, so now let's talk about how money is measured in the US today. There are two groups of money definitions of the money supply, M1 and M2. I'm not going to ask you to calculate M1 and M2, but I want you to understand that M1 is the narrow definition. Includes currency in circulation, checking account, deposits, traveler's checks. People barely use traveler's checks anymore. And then M2 is more broad definition that includes balances in money market deposits, non-institutional money market fund shares, in addition to M1. So we're not going to talk too much about this, but which version of the definition should we use? Either one's valid. But mostly as economists, we're concerned about money's role as a medium of exchange. So that suggests using M1. In our discussion of money, we're going to be treating currency and checking account balances as money, but nothing else. Banks play an important role in the money supply because they control what happens to money that's in a checking account. What about debit cards or credit cards? Debit cards, they directly access checking accounts, but the card itself isn't considered money. The checking account balance is what's considered money. Credit cards are not representative of money. Because essentially a credit card is the way you obtain a short-term loan from a bank until you pay off the bill. And so the transaction isn't really complete until you pay off the loan. So the credit card itself doesn't represent money. Okay. So again, we're going to be focusing on the M1 definition because we want to think about money as a medium of exchange. So here is where we can talk about, are Bitcoins considered money? E-money is been around for the last decade, so we can kind of talk about Bitcoin as a newer form of e-money. It's not made by government or a firm. It's made by a decentralized system of linked computers, which, again, I'm not going to get too much into Bitcoin. If you're really interested in that, I suggest that you research that on your own. But essentially, Bitcoins can be traded for other currencies through the web. Some websites may accept Bitcoin as a form of payment. Should Bitcoins be considered in the measure of the money supply? Right now they're not, but if they grow more popular in the future, maybe they should be considered. That is another topic up for debate. The IRS actually did come out with guidance as far as how to account for currency transactions that are virtual. And so it's important that if you are trading in virtual currencies, you understand the tax consequences behind using that virtual currency to pay for goods and services, or holding it as an investment. It can result in a tax liability. So keep that in mind when you're looking into virtual currencies. Okay, so now let's move on and talk about how banks create money. So watch the video about the goldsmith tale on YouTube via the link in the module. I will upload that link if it's not already there, and it's a really great YouTube video that simplifies it and kind of explains it in a story about how banks create money. So keep in mind, you're holding more currency in checking accounts than there is in the actual economy. So somehow money is going to be created by banks. Banks do make profit, right? So their activities are going to allow themselves to make a profit as well as create money. So we need to understand how banks operate as businesses. So again, we're not going to talk too much about the bank balance sheet in this course, but we are going to talk about reserves, required reserves, and the required reserve ratio. So banks have to keep some cash available for their depositors. It does that through a combination of vault cash and deposits with the Fed. So the Federal Reserve is the bank for banks, and the required reserves are the required reserves is the amount of currency the banks are required to hold by the government, and it's based on the checking account deposits. The reserve ratio is the minimum fraction of deposits banks are required by law to keep as reserves, and we're going to work on calculating that in a future video. So keep that in mind when you're watching the video about the goldsmith's tale that explains a little bit about how banks have evolved historically and how they create money. Okay, so banks may choose to hold excess reserves, which are reserves over the legal requirement. And then we also have here the simple deposit multiplier ratio of the amount of deposits created by the banks to the amount of new reserves. Again, these definitions may be difficult to understand in this video, but after you've watched The Goldsmith's Tale, how many times have I said that? You should really watch it. Then it'll be easier to understand. Okay, so again, see the bank worksheets, the video in the module for practice on calculations related to reserve requirements, the multiplier, and the money supply. So I want you to be able to understand the multiplier, reserve requirement, and all of that, and there is a separate video in this module that has practice worksheets over that. It's going to be tested, so keep that in mind. Okay, so now let's move on from that and talk about the Federal Reserve System. In the US, banks keep less than 100% of deposits as reserve. This is known as the fractional banking system. Bank run and bank panic. Remember the Goldsmith's Tale video? A bank run is when a lot of depositors come and want their money out of the bank. And a bank panic is when many banks experience bank runs at the same time. So essentially what happens in a bank panic is there's a feedback loop. The Fed tries to prevent the bank runs and bank panic by acting as a lender of last resort. Here I said that central banks like the Fed help to prevent bank runs and panics by acting as let's go ahead and highlight that, a lender of last resort, promising to make loans to banks in order to pay off the depositors. The assurance can break the negative feedback loop. So what happens is the economy essentially, as output, employment, and asset prices decline, it causes banks to fail. Depositors question the value of the underlying assets. They line up, demand their money. The bank pays out until they run out. It causes contagion as depositors demand funds from other banks, and the banks react and they sell assets, reduce loans to households and firms, which worsens the economy's output, unemployment, and inflation situation. So, in the late 19th century, early 20th century, several bank panics occurred. Then in 1914, the Fed was started. It makes loans to banks called discount loans. It charges a discount rate, which is the interest, right? You're not going to loan someone money without charging them an interest rate. So then we had the Great Depression in the 1930s, in which a lot of bank runs happened, and so a lot of banks ended up failing. And in response to the Great Depression, Congress established the FDIC, which insured deposits in the banks. It essentially guarantees to help out banks and try to limit bank panics. So what is the Fed? The Fed is broken up into 12 Federal Reserve districts, each of which provides services to banks in the district. So the Federal Reserve Bank is the Bank of the U.S., and it essentially serves all of the regional banks across the U.S. The real power in the Fed lies with the Board of Governors in Washington, D.C. So 8 times a year, the Federal Open Market Committee is going to be responsible for open market operations and managing the money supply in the U.S. We'll talk about this during our monetary policy chapter. And we're introducing it, but we'll talk about it more. So what is monetary policy? Actions the Fed takes to manage the money supply and the interest rates. They use 3 tools: open market operations, discount policy, and reserve requirements. I'm going to let you read that for yourself. Again, we're going to have a whole chapter over monetary policy. So before we move on, I do want to talk a little bit about the bank letter designation on some currency, and I'll insert another video in here where I explain it, but essentially this is the chart I'll be referring to in that video. So keep that in mind. So now let's move on to the last section. The last section talks about the quantity theory of money. We referred to this a little bit in the last video. Quantity theory of money, it was created by Irving Fisher in trying to establish the relationship between money and prices. So we came up with this relationship using the quantity equation, which ended up being M times V equals P times Y. So let's label what each one is. M equals the money supply. V equals the velocity of money, which I defined for you down here. P equals the price level. And Y equals output, which we should know from understanding GDP. So we can rewrite this equation by dividing through by M. So we would obtain V equals P times Y over M, which is the velocity equation, number of times each dollar in the money supply is used to purchase goods and services included in GDP. So we can always calculate velocity, but will we always get the same example? The quantity theory of money asserts that subject to measurement error, we will get the same answer, because the quantity theory of money states that there's a connection between money and prices that assumes velocity of money is constant. So if our velocity is constant, then we see M equals P, because if we increase the money supply, we'll see an increase in price level. Okay, so I know the quantity theory of money may be a little bit confusing, but I just basically want you to understand that it asserts the velocity of money is constant. So P times Y, that is what equals nominal GDP. Because that's the level of real output with real GDP, so P times Y is going to be nominal GDP. So in this case, we can use price level as the GDP deflator, and we'll always be able to calculate velocity like I mentioned earlier. So when variables are multiplied together, we are forming the same equation with their growth rates added together. So growth rate of the money supply times growth rate of the money supply plus growth rate of velocity is going to equal growth rate of the price level, or the inflation rate, plus the growth rate of real output. So is velocity truly constant from year to year? The answer is going to be no, because the money supply, when it grows faster than real GDP, there's going to be inflation. If it grows slower, there's going to be deflation. And if it grows at the same rate, there'll be neither deflation nor inflation, and the price level will be stable. So if the price level is stable, and we're assuming that real output is also going to be stable. That's why we can conclude that increases in the money supply will equal increases in the price level. So, again, velocity is assumed to be constant. Our output is assumed to be consistent over time. That's why we can make the conclusion that increases in the money will result in increases in the price level, or decreases in the money will result in decreases in the price level, and vice versa. Okay, with that being said, I encourage you to watch the videos that I put up regarding the bank worksheets. So make sure you work on that and be able to understand how I'm calculating those numbers. If you have questions, please let me know. In this video, I just wanted to show you really quickly that you can identify the Federal Reserve District that we talked about, one of the 12 districts, on different currencies, specifically, or different currency amounts in the US. So all small size $1 notes, all small 5, 10, 20, and 50, and 100 notes will actually bear the letter of the issuing Federal Reserve District on the seal of the currency. And they'll also have a serial number prefix letter and the bank's identifying number in all four corners of the note. So we can see here, I just pulled out some dollars from my wallet, and so you can see here, it's a $1. It has the letter F on it. So on your notes, you can see that each of the 12 districts has their own letter. So letter F, so this means that this dollar bill was issued by the Atlanta Federal Reserve. And so you can see that it also has the number 6, so that is the corresponding number related to the Atlanta branch. So let's look at this other dollar. So here you can see that it's a K. K represents the Dallas Fed. I've actually been there, and it's very interesting to walk around and kind of just see the building downtown there. And so you can also see the number 11 corresponds with the Dallas Fed. And then finally here I have the last one is the letter D, and the letter D corresponds to the Cleveland Fed and the corresponding number 4. So I think it's just interesting to kind of look to see, where the different dollars had been issued from, and in my case happened to be issued from 3 separate Federal Reserve banks. So just an interesting tad bit there.